Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 58, the Shang Dynasty. And so with the defeat of the Shah at Mingtao, Duke Tang of the Shang stood victorious. He was now king on account of his virtuous nature, deposing the evil king Jie, who had lost the mandate of heaven. His people were now set to guide the realm towards a prosperous future. Last episode, I mentioned that Tang allowed many Shah nobles to keep their land. This is something Sima Qian, the great Chinese historian, records as having taken place. But Tang had no problem booting out anyone he suspected of copying an attitude with his new rule. As he addresses his lords in an early speech, "If you do not do good deeds for your people and are not diligent in your tasks, I'm going to heavily punish and condemn you. Do not harbor resentment against me." The year is about 1600 BC, give or take a few decades, and we're about to see the first real dynasty of China. Whereas the evidence on the Shah is inconclusive, there's lots of evidence from the Shang. Their bronze work is really quite spectacular, with a great variety of different vessels for drinking, cooking, and storing water and food. Weapons as well, with a bunch of axe heads with big toothy grinning faces. It was thought for a while that the ancient Chinese must have picked up the secrets of bronze technology from trade, because the archaeological record goes from nothing to, poof, amazing bronze art. But no, recent findings definitely confirm that this was an independent discovery. The Shang Dynasty is also the first time that we see a codified Chinese script. The early Han scholars believed that the Chinese written language came from pictographic origins, and you can definitely see that influence in modern Chinese writing. Take the symbol for tree, which you'll probably need to look up on your own, but basically it's kind of a cross with two curved lines protruding down and out from the horizontal line. Kind of like a tree. And if you take two of these symbols and put them together, you now have the word for woods. And if you take three together, two side by side and one on top, you have the symbol for forest. Seems rational, right? Well, the earliest assumed dates for the advent of writing in China hover around the 1200s, but it's feasible that it was earlier than that. Problem is, it would have been written on bamboo and soft organic material and other stuff that can't really survive 3,000 years in the ground, so most of the writing we get comes from the various bronze vessels and objects known as oracle bones. They're animal bones for divination, telling the future, mostly from the plastron of a turtle or tortoise, which is the bottom shell, and the occasional ox scapula too. A typical scene plays out like this. The king has a question. Will the harvest be good? And the diviner, really more of a pyromancer, which'll make sense in just 1 second, carves the question into the shell and then roasts it over a hot flame, hence the pyromancer title. At such a high temperature, the bone will crack. The pyromancer interprets what the cracks mean, if it's an auspicious or inauspicious meaning, and then the answer is carved back onto the shell as well. As you can imagine then, religion plays a big role in the Shang world, with ancestor worship becoming more prevalent alongside a diverse pantheon of gods. Shangdi is the supreme deity, who eventually becomes synonymous with heaven itself. I don't want to get too much into their religion because we're going to spend more time in a later episode about the big religions/philosophies of ancient China, but one interesting and grim fact about the Shang is that they practiced human sacrifice. Not uncommon in the ancient world, obviously, but it's still odd all the same. At one side in particular, the numerous bodies of those sacrificed were lined up side by side facing down, with their heads removed, or rather partially removed, as most bodies still contained part of their jawbone. Why this is, who knows. But let's get back to King Tang. Tang's benevolent rule is aided in no small part by his chief advisor, Yi Yin. Always the model ruler, Tang believed that, "I have said before, when people look into the water, they see their reflections. When they look at the common people, they know if their country is well regulated." Tang adjusted the calendar, improved the royal fashion sense, and behaved knowing he was trying to set an example to his countrymen. And after a long life of fighting drought and barbarians, he dies after about 30 years and passes the throne to his son, who dies shortly after that, and passes the throne to his son, who dies quickly after that. Not really a good start, but that's okay because Chief Advisor Yi Yin is still around, and King Tong's grandson is available for the job. Deja takes the throne and immediately behaves exactly how someone young and spoiled would. He's mean, he's impatient, he's nasty to boot. And since he wouldn't listen to his advisors, the whole court starts to fall apart until Yi Yin takes a drastic step towards preserving the safety and security of the realm. He grounds the young king to his room for 3 years. Okay, not grounded per se, exiled to a country palace, but still, for 3 years. And when that time was up, Deja returns home to the Shang capital of Anyang a changed man. He apologized for his actions and promised to be a better leader. Wow. And Yi Yin returned all governing duties back to the young king. Over the next few leaders, it's a common tale of taking the throne, dying, passing it to a son, them taking the throne, dying, etc., with many of these kings moving the capital around several times. Why move the administrative center of a growing kingdom so much? Barbarian invaders? Natural disasters? Just plain change of scenery? No one's totally sure, but eventually the Shang settled on the city of Yin, just north of the Yellow River and about 350 miles south of modern Beijing. This was the work of the 19th Shang king, Pan Keng, who had the idea after consulting the oracle bones. His followers weren't too keen on moving around again, but to allay their fears, he said, "As a felled tree puts forth new shoots, so heaven will decree us renewed strength in a new city. And if you don't like it, I have some smiling axe heads you can talk to." So the Shang settle at Yin, and in many ancient texts, the Shang Dynasty is actually called the Yin at this point. But to keep things simple, we're going to stick with the Shang moniker. The next king of merit is the 22nd, called Wu Ding. A modest man and a bit of a scholar, Sima Qian writes that Wu Ding didn't talk at all during his first 3 years on the throne, letting his prime minister and the administrative staff handle all affairs. Probably to show how effective a leader he is. He also had a panic attack after watching a pheasant catch fire from landing on a sacrificial vessel. This was interpreted as a sign to keep being virtuous and make sure his vassals were too, or else. Now, not mentioned by Sima Qian are the accounts of his wife, or rather one of his wives, Fu Hao. Wu Ding had the great idea that to make all the various surrounding tribes loyal to him, he'd take a wife from each of them, some 60 in total. Most would spend their days quietly obeying the mores of the time, but not Fu Hao, who deftly worked her way through the social confines of her position and was not only able to participate in religious ceremonies forbidden to women, but also became one of Wu Ding's military generals. She defeated at least 3 other rogue tribes and was so highly regarded that upon her death, Wu Ding ordered a massive tomb constructed for her, complete with human sacrifices and all. Now, do we know all of this? Because just as King Tut survived nearly 3 millennia of tomb robbers, so did Fu Hao. Her tomb was found undisturbed with hundreds of military weapons, oracle bones, jade ornaments, and even cowrie shells, which were a form of currency at the time. It's even available to visit in China today, which is definitely on my to-see list whenever I can get back there. Well, as is starting to become a familiar story, the Shang just couldn't keep up with the lofty standards of their greatest kings. The 24th king, Zhu Jia, was infamous for his libido, and the 27th, Wu Yi, had a weird pleasure in mocking the Shang religion, creating his own little idols and filling leather pouches with blood to hang and use as target practice, which he called shooting at heaven. Of course, in a bit of Caddyshack-type humor, while out on a hunt, Wu Yi is struck down by lightning. But these kings pale in comparison to the last of the Shang line, the great and terrible Di Xin. He's got all the capabilities to be a great ruler, bright, clever, persuasive, and strong, but of course, that's all taken with the usual egomania and cruelty seen in these guys. He's a big fan of hunting, wine, and women, keeping a particularly nasty lady named Daji as a mistress. Sounds kinda similar to King Jie of the Xia, right? Well, not to be outdone, he built his own wine lake. Actually, the wine name is a bit of an incorrect translation. It's really more of a millet ale. But he also had trees planted around it, with roasted meat hanging from its branches. Thirsty? Reach in and scoop up a drink. Hungry? Reach out and grab a steak. Which, admittedly, doesn't sound that bad. but it'd be hard to keep the food down knowing what else Di Xin was capable of. Because whereas Jie was content to simply execute anybody who spoke down to him, Di Xin got creative. Creative in ways only the truly unhinged can get. His favorite method of punishment involved taking a large bronze pillar, greasing it up, heating it over a great fire, and then forcing someone to walk over it. Naturally, after a few steps, the poor victim would lose balance and fall into the fire, whereupon Di Xin would, as you might expect, burst into laughter. But that's only the beginning. One nobleman's daughter rejected his advances, so in a fit of rage he killed her. Another noble, this time a marquis, actually stood up to Di Xin, and was promptly killed, carved into strips, and turned into jerky. There's one more nasty thing he does, which I'll get to in a moment, but in between all the executions and torture, Di Xin makes a critical mistake. It has to do with the visiting chief of the Zhou tribe. The Zhou exist west of the Shang and were not subjects, and although their chief maintained good terms with the Shang, they were not beholden to the king. Except what are laws and social graces to the chosen of heaven? The Zhou leader was at the capital city of Yin on business when Di Xin's spies reported that the man had, quote, sighed in secret over the behavior of the Shang king. So he was tossed in jail. The Zhou tribe was rightly outraged, but to their credit, instead of racing off to war, they offered a conciliatory gift. Precious objects and nice ladies, which was enough to assuage the temper of the Shang king. With that, the Zhou chief was released, but refused to leave his prison. He would not return home until Di Xin promised to start treating his subjects better. Pretty gutsy, huh? He even proposed a trade. If Di Xin would at least stop using that horrible bronze pillar, then the Zhou would cede a decent-sized chunk of good farming land around the Low River. Di Xin took the deal, of course, and the Zhou chief went home. The Shang king had been mollified, pacified, and was completely in the dark about the foolish mistake he made. Safely back in his own turf, the Zhou chief began to garner support for a rebellion, a grand uprising against the cruel and barbarous Shang. Lords and nobles joined up, as did courtiers and sages who abandoned the capital to join up with the Zhou. Now, as the chieftain was about 100 years old at the time, he died before he could carry out the attack, so leadership passed on to his son, Wu. With a great coalition pledging their support for him, they clamored to engage the Shang. They cried out to him, Di Xin can be subjugated. But Wu was patient. You do not know the mandate of heaven yet. Maybe he was remaining hopeful that Di Xin would turn things around, but that wasn't happening. The Shang king knew that things were falling apart, and yet he still held fast to his cruel ways. His uncle, a learned and wise man, was summoned to offer words of support during this time. As your humble servant, one has to struggle, even at the risk of death. Di Xin snapped at him and spoke. I've heard that a sage's heart has 7 openings. And he gutted him to see if it was true. Apparently, once the court musicians fled to the Zhou, that was the cue that heaven really had abandoned the Shang, and that Wu was finally ready. He rallied his men. I have received the command of my deceased father. I have offered special sacrifice to the supreme God. I have performed the due services to the great earth, and I lead the multitude of you to execute the punishment appointed by heaven. Heaven shares the suffering of the people. What the people desire, heaven will give effect to. Do you aid me, this one man, to cleanse forever all within the 4 seas? Now is the time. It should not be lost. The Zhou had assembled a mighty army, but even while the Shang had an expeditionary force on the eastern fringe of their kingdom, they still had an even larger army to face the Zhou from the west. This is the Battle of Mu Ye, where the outnumbered forces of the Zhou stood defiant against the legions of Shang troops. But time and time again, history shows us that battles are not necessarily won by numbers. For the Zhou had a weapon the Shang lacked. War chariots, an intimidating sight on any battlefield. They also had a cause, to overthrow a depraved, wicked man. Conversely, the Shang army's front line was made up of armed peasants, essentially enslaved conscripts who had no desire to surrender their lives away. Upon the approach of the Zhou, they planted their spears upside down in the ground and about-faced, attacking any Shang soldier loyal enough or stupid enough to defend the doomed despot. As news of the carnage reached Di Xin in his capital at Yin, he knew his days were numbered and beelined it to the central palace building to don his royal armor. But he never gets a chance to die in glory. The translations and accounts are mixed. Most suggest Di Xin intentionally sets fire to his palace and dies in the blaze, but other accounts I've read seem to suggest that the Zhou are the fire starters here, setting alight the entire complex. Regardless of how it started, the fire kills Di Xin, who dies somewhere between 1100 and 1000 BC. Could be 1075 or 1046, whatever, he's dead. The Shang Dynasty followed the same path and met the same fate as the Xia kings. Start out good, lose your way, get someone good again, but slowly descend into increased depravity until someone says enough is enough. And while both Duke Tong and the newly ascendant King Wu of the Zhou both regretted the need to create chaos to bring order back to the land, Wu didn't seem to mind a bit of violence. The Zhou dynasty had begun when the last king of the Shang, who was supposed to emulate the noble example of Tong and Yu the Great before him, had his charred and severed head shoved on a pike outside the gates of Yin. Next time, you guessed it, we're off to explore the Zhou dynasty. It's the longest dynasty in Chinese history, some 800 years in total. And while it's got the normal exciting statecraft, wars, and palace intrigue, this dynasty is also famous for the appearance of some of China's most revered philosophers and authors. Which means we'll probably take a break at some point from all the beer pools and debauchery to have ourselves another philosophy episode. But all in good time and patience, for he who is prudent and lies in wait for an enemy who is not will be victorious. Or something like that. Prepare for the Zhou on the podcast history of our world.